coastal geological processes. But the talk he'll be giving us this evening is not work related to his studies of Cape Cod and northeastern United States, but the Caspian Sea. And the title of his talk this evening is The Caspian Sea, the Jewel of Two Continents. David?
Thank you, Judy. And it's a pleasure to be back to this Oceans Alive series. A couple of years ago when the series opened, I gave a short talk on sea level rise. So it's a pleasure to be able to come back after a couple of years and see some familiar faces in the audience again. I'd like to start out this talk with a little bit of a mind experiment. So if you can all just close your eyes for a second and picture an extensive inland body of water. And this inland body of water extends all the way from Eastport, Maine, the farthest northeastern point of the United States, and it goes all the way down to the south, all the way to the Outer Banks, down to the Cape, and it extends inland all the way to Detroit and on south to Atlanta. Just picture this huge portion of the eastern United States, and this portion, this area, is the same area as the Caspian Sea. And this is going to be the subject of the talk tonight. So we're talking about a huge region of the globe. And the way I'd like to start out is to set the stage for the Caspian. 2 years ago, I really didn't know where the Caspian Sea was. Particularly, I knew roughly where it was. But since then, I've had the opportunity to work in the Caspian and to visit it and to learn a little bit about its history. So we'll start the journey today in the Caspian by taking a short caravan across from China to the European region by camel, which is still a mode of travel on occasion in Kazakhstan, and start out this discussion by reviewing some of the old trade routes that used to go through the Caspian Sea. Now, you've probably all heard of the Great Silk Road. This was the caravan route that started out back in the 2nd or 3rd century BC, taking primarily silk from the region of China and moving along various routes, northerly routes, middle routes, and southerly routes over towards Egypt and up to Europe and to Russia. The Caspian Sea, which we'll talk about today, was right at the crossroads of these different caravan routes. Several of the caravan routes went north or south around the Caspian Sea. And imagine riding on a camel for thousands of kilometers and encountering this massive sea. You can imagine being the first group to do it and wondering whether you turn right or turn left to go across. And imagine encountering it at about New Jersey and going north for a while and traveling 500 kilometers north and still not finding the end of it, turning around, traveling 1,000 kilometers south, and still not finding the end of it. This is a massive, massive sea, about 1,000 kilometers long by about 400 kilometers from east to west. It contains about 44% of all of the inland water in the world. So if you take all the Great Lakes, the Great Salt Lake, if you take Lake Baikal, all the other large lakes you can think of, the Caspian Sea accounts for nearly half of all the inland water in the world. Not only is its surface area large, but also it attains great depths to more than one kilometer deep. So it's a massive body of water with very important history to it, as well as very important environmental problems right now. So I'd like to set the stage and just show you a few pictures, if I can, of the Caspian region. Again, up until about a year ago or so, I'd never visited the region, didn't know what to expect. So I'll take you on a little sightseeing tour on your right for a few minutes and just explain what the Caspian Sea looks like, why it's particularly notable, and then I'd like to get into some of the more environmental issues. I'd like to mention that we have a visiting scientist with us, Dr. Tatiana Glushko, who's sitting in the front row. Dr. Glushko is a scientist from Moscow who's spent her career studying the Caspian Sea. So if you have any difficult questions about the Caspian, I'm going to ask Dr. Glushko to answer those for me. Now, a lot of the talk tonight is going to focus on Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a large country, part of the former Soviet Union, which borders along China to the east, along the Tian Shan Mountains, and on the western portion of Kazakhstan borders Russia, and then also has a significant portion of coastline on the Caspian Sea. And I'll talk about that in some detail because Kazakhstan is the country with which I've been working most closely. A few weeks ago, about a month ago, I guess, on 60 Minutes, they had a special on Semipalatinsk, which is a town located right about here. And this is one of the major bases for the former Soviet Union nuclear bases. So up in the left-hand corner, we can see the Caspian Sea. The Caspian is surrounded by 5 countries: Kazakhstan, shown in green, Russia, including Dagestan coast here, Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkmenistan. So these are the 5 countries that now border the Caspian, whereas before it was just 2 countries. Since the breakup of the former Soviet Union, it's now 5. So my discussion tonight will be a little bit Kazakhstan-centric because this is where most of my work has occurred. This area was known in the historical past as being an area with intensive nomadic people. There are very few permanent settlements in this region, partly because of the political instability. Hordes of Mongols and hordes of other people kept passing through this region time after time after time. So it was a place where there weren't large settlements, but instead many very small settlements, such as the one that we see on your right-hand side. And some of these settlements still exist, and some of the people in this region are still nomadic. As we talk about the environmental problems of the Caspian, we'll talk a little bit about how the nomadic people were able to adapt to some of the environmental issues that arose in the Caspian Sea. But with the incursion of more permanent settlements, it's more difficult for the people to adapt to some of the environmental problems. The Kazakhs are a very colorful people, as are the Turkmenis. There's a lot of history and color and culture in the region, which makes it extremely fascinating to visit. Now, Kazakhstan, as I say, shares a common border with China, and this border is a large mountain range called the Tian Shan Mountains, or the Mountains of Heaven. The area is relatively mild in temperature. The capital of Kazakhstan, Almaty, experiences a lot of snow, but it doesn't get quite as cold as it gets here in Woodsoil, at least not this past winter. So it's a very attractive place. The Caspian Sea at times can be very peaceful, very lake-like, but at other times can be fairly rough. We'll talk a little bit about the Caspian Sea and some of its waves and surges. At times the surges can reach, the wind surges during storms can reach 1 or 2 meters. The area around the Caspian is so flat that these surges travel 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers inland. So much for our cries about storm surges and storm damage. When we have a storm, we hit the first cottage. Here the boats will go inland 10 kilometers to 20 kilometers. Extremely flat, low-lying, very difficult place to live. It helps if you're a nomad, so you can get out of the way of those storm surges or get out of the way of sea level rise. The natural history here is quite diverse. The Caspian Sea doesn't particularly have a large number of marine species associated with it. It's a fairly impoverished sea, and I call it a sea because it has a salinity of about 12 parts per thousand. So as an oceanographer, I'm allowed to study it because it's still salty, still has internal waves, it still has stratification, and the things that I'm paid to study. But compared to other seas, the Caspian is fairly impoverished. One of the unique things about it, though, is because it's isolated, it does have a very high degree of endemism in its fauna. In other words, the organisms that develop new strains through speciation that are found only in the Caspian Sea and not in other places. So from the standpoint of studying conservation of marine biodiversity, the Caspian is a very useful laboratory, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The Caspian Sea is a beautiful coastline, though most of it is, or much of it is desert. This is a small town on the eastern Caspian called Aktau. very nice location. Unfortunately, it's very symptomatic of the types of environmental problems pressing on particularly Kazakhstan and some of the other countries of the Caspian region. This particular town is near a uranium processing plant. There's a high degree of cancer in this region because of the mindless dumping of uranium tailings over town. Also large chemical dumps from different processing plants, relatively uncontrolled oil pollution in this region. So you have a beautiful setting like this, but people are flocking out of Oktau now that they've got the freedom to travel because of all the pollution, all the health-related issues. This is a real shame, and this is the focus of a study that we're proposing for the Caspian for the next 5 or 10 years. The fauna and flora, as I mentioned, are quite diverse. Caspian is an extremely important place for overwintering of birds and as a flyby or flyway for birds traveling north and south through the Asian and European continents. Flamingos, vast numbers of flamingos, millions and millions of birds go through this region. It's an extremely important world treasure for bird life. Unfortunately, let's see, maybe on the right-hand side, you can't see it very well, is a sturgeon. I think this is a beluga sturgeon. This is one of the reasons why the Caspian is best known. Caspian Sea contains between 85% and 90% of all the sturgeon resources in the entire world. So in other places, as sturgeon die out, such as the Black Sea, such as the East Coast and West Coast of the United States, the Caspian is becoming more and more important as a place for sturgeon. Sturgeon are one of the oldest phylogenetic sequences in the marine realm and are very important for study for that particular academic reason. This particular sturgeon doesn't look particularly large. He might be about 4 or 5 feet long. Some sturgeon get up to 1,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds. Sturgeon can live up to 100 years. Like us, they reach sexual maturity at an age of about 14 to 18 years. So whatever we do to the sturgeon today is going to affect the population for the next 15 to 20 years or so. So we've got to be very careful how we help try to conserve the sturgeon. Unfortunately, with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, poaching for sturgeon has become a popular pastime, as sturgeon are a sure source of foreign currency in an area where foreign currency is extremely difficult to obtain. So here we see a fisherman with a catch of these sturgeon. One sturgeon here, I believe they're Sevruga sturgeon. I'm not 100% sure, and other sturgeon in this area. All told, I believe there are 5 species of sturgeon and 2 subspecies of sturgeon in the Caspian Sea region. Why do we like sturgeon? Well, obviously, the fish flesh itself is very good, but also for the caviar. And this is one of the sturgeon fish being cut open to get its caviar. This is the caviar from one of the sturgeon. A single sturgeon can produce up to 10, 12 pounds of caviar. And when you consider that caviar fetches a price of something like $25 or $30 per 50 grams, 5 to 10 kilograms of caviar is extremely important for the local economy. And this is the way it ends up. For those of you who are lucky enough to get this much caviar, I've never had that much at one sitting in my life, but big tins of 1 kilogram tins of caviar. Now the sturgeon live largely, or spend a large part of their life cycle in the North Caspian Sea, but they also migrate to other parts of the Caspian Sea, so they're at risk because of activities throughout the Caspian. Well, besides sturgeon, what is the big cash crop from this region? Other than in the major river deltas, which I'll show you in a while, there's not a lot of agriculture. The big business around here really is oil. And for those of you who read Daniel Jurgen's book, The Prize, talked about the oil, the history of oil development in world politics. You read I believe, the second chapter, which talked about the oil around the Baku region, which the Nobels helped develop about 100 years ago, and then which the French Rothschilds came in and helped develop. Well, since then, oil has popped up not only in Baku, but also around Astrakhan in the Volga River Delta. This is really a gas condensate, not oil itself. And then hydrocarbons also in the eastern part of the Caspian Sea. Sea level rise is we'll talk a little bit more about the oil development in a few minutes as well. Sea level rise is a big problem in the Caspian Sea. Sea level rises and falls by meters, many, many feet over a short period of time. From 1933 roughly to 1977, the water level in the Caspian Sea dropped about 10 to 12 feet. Between 1977 and present, water level has risen about 7 feet. So we worry about our sea level rise of a millimeter per year or a foot per century. Sea level rise and fall in the Caspian Sea is a major issue. And in this particular case, it's a significant issue because much of the oil drilling takes place on the margins of the Caspian Sea, and these oil platforms are now being threatened by pollution. So this is a little bit of a background. Caspian is an extremely diverse region. It's really a world treasure. It's not just a national treasure for Russia or Kazakhstan or any of the other riparian states. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the natural history of the Caspian Sea, and then talk about a program which Dr. Glushko and I are working on to help preserve the biodiversity of the Caspian region. So let's leave the caravans aside for a minute, unfortunately, and look at a close-up of the Caspian Sea here. So the Caspian Sea, as I mentioned, is about 1,000 kilometers from north to south, about 400 kilometers from east to west, and it consists of three distinct geomorphic elements. The North Caspian Sea occupies about a quarter of the area of the entire Caspian. However, in terms of volume of water, it only contains about half of 1% of the volume of water. The North Caspian is extremely shallow, being at all times less than 20 meters deep and generally just a matter of a couple of meters deep. And we'll focus on the North Caspian later. The Middle Caspian Sea and the South Caspian Sea roughly share the remainder of the area of the Caspian Sea, with water depths, as I indicated, in the South Caspian getting to over 1,000 meters. Baku, that I mentioned before, is an area of oil production right now. The Tengiz oil field off northeast Caspian Sea is an area of active production. I showed you earlier the town of Aktau, and Aktau is located on a small peninsula right in here, still within Kazakhstan. There are major rivers that feed this region. The Volga River is the largest river in Europe. It drains much of the European continent and drains into the North Caspian Sea. The Ural River is another significant river, and then a variety of smaller rivers, the Terek, Samur, Kura, and smaller rivers stretched around the Caspian. Much of the Caspian is desert area. However, along the Baku region, there is it's the beginnings of the Caucasus Mountains exist, and there's a large rainfall there and less desert conditions there than elsewhere. The northern Caspian Sea, which again I'm going to focus on a little bit, can be divided into several different areas, but ones that we'll discuss a little bit more detail are the massive Volga Delta and the Ural Delta located over on the east. The border between Russia and Kazakhstan is located right along this divide. So the Volga River exists both in Kazakhstan and in Russia. The salinity, as I mentioned, of surface waters in the summertime make this lake really a sea. So we call it a sea lake, just so I'm still allowed to study it. But the salinity profile looks like this, with basically fresh water off of Astrakhan region, off the Volga River Delta, and then increasingly more saline water down to about 13.5 parts per thousand along the east coast of the Caspian Sea. The fresh water comes in, generally hugs the coast as it moves down through the Caspian Sea, and the denser water, the more saline water, tends to be against the eastern part of the Caspian Sea. The Caspian has been studied for a long time. The currents in the Caspian Sea, the oceanography is basically driven by this huge volume of water coming in through the Volga River. And the Volga is by far the largest river in the Caspian Sea. The Ural River is just a fraction, maybe some 5 to 10% of the total flow of the Volga River. So the Volga River, by contributing all the fresh water, creates a general flow down along the west coast of the Caspian towards the south. But the flow in the North Caspian is very strongly dependent on the local winds. And you can see from these cartoons, derived from a few observations, that the local currents, surface currents, are very much a function of the different wind directions. And this is important for a variety of reasons, including pollution and the transport of pollution through the area. Now, the Russians have been the nationality that have studied the Caspian most. Most of the Caspian experts actually live in Russia rather than the other former Soviet Union states. And they've had a very advanced study of the Caspian Sea, including numerical modeling of the currents within the Caspian. And I just showed this to indicate that unlike some of the places we visit and work, the Caspian has been studied by world-class experts quite a bit. So we have a lot of excellent scientific knowledge about the Caspian Sea, and we're able to apply some of this excellent scientific information for management of the system. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel in the Caspian Sea. We can stand on the broad shoulders of the Russian scientists and other scientists who have studied this region for many, many years. From an environmental standpoint, there are some very sensitive regions in the North Caspian Sea. The sturgeon feeding areas are the areas that are shown in this orange color here. Of course, the sturgeon feed elsewhere, but the primary feeding area for the sturgeons is in this location. Now, remember, sturgeons go upriver to spawn, so the rivers are an extremely important part of the Caspian Sea ecosystem and are a major factor in the contributing to the diversity of the Caspian Sea ecosystem. The area in blue, which we outline here, is an area of what's known as the Caspian seal hunting grounds. Maybe 18 to 20,000 years before this time, the glaciers extended down along the northern part of Russia, and the rivers, instead of flowing to the north, the Ob, the Yenisei, and some of these rivers, instead of flowing to the north, flowed to the south. And along with this water coming from the glacier melt to the north came Caspian seals. And at present, there are about 500,000 Caspian seals in the Arctic seals in the Caspian region. So the fauna and flora is a mixture. Not only is there a large amount of endemic fauna and flora within the Caspian region, but also there's a significant quantity of Arctic species, including these 500,000 Arctic seals. Besides the Arctic fauna, the other major contributing fauna is the Mediterranean fauna. During periods past geological times, several times within the geological past, the Caspian Sea was connected to the Black Sea, and this allowed the Mediterranean fauna to come into the Black Sea, to the Caspian Sea, contributing to the diversity of the Caspian Sea fauna and flora at the same time. So this Caspian Sea seal hunting grounds are extremely important for the overall balance, ecological balance of the Caspian Sea. The seals come up here, are hunted up here because of the ice cover in the wintertime, and the seals will give birth to their young, they will molt, and they will mate also, all on the ice during the wintertime. There are fisheries of the sturgeon that are allowed only within the river deltas right now by law, according to laws set up in the early 1960s, 63, 64, 65. So those laws prevent any open sea fishing of the sturgeon and only permit it in the river deltas themselves. Unfortunately, with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, enforcement is not what it should be, and the poaching is extremely rampant, and the sturgeon fisheries there's a great fear that the sturgeon fisheries are going to disappear. The Volga River is an extremely important contributor to the overall ecosystem. It's a massive delta. Much of it has been broken apart and broken into rice fields. When sea level dropped from 1933 to 1977, much of the former delta was actually occupied and levees were built up and rice fields were put in place. Now, because of sea level rise, the rice fields are threatened. Portions of Astrakhan are threatened as well. And there's a discussion, a serious discussion in Russia to build a big levee across the entire northwest part of the Caspian Sea. As we'll discuss in a moment, for several reasons, this is a horrible idea. But it's fairly characteristic of the massive engineering efforts that the former Soviet Union has carried out in the past. Now, this levee would, in essence, protect the Volga Delta from sea level rise, a concept which I find somewhat absurd. But when you talk to scientists at Moscow State University, they think is a logical planned course of action. There are significant cultural differences between some types of scientists in the former Soviet Union and what we've grown to expect here in the U.S. The biological diversity or organisms tend to like gradients of different sorts. They like to have gradients in temperature or gradients in salinity. And in the northwest Caspian in particular, these salinity gradients are very strong, where you have fairly fresh water, maybe just 1 part per thousand or so against the delta. Then you have a zone of mixing between the fresher waters and the slightly more saline waters, and a frontal zone. And this area is extremely important for fisheries, maintenance of the fisheries, again, because the organisms tend to like to live in this area of strong gradients, provides varying different kinds of habitats. Besides the delta materials itself, there's also in the intrastream region between the Volga River and the Ural River to the east, there's an area of massive region of reed beds, and these reed beds may be 1 or 2 kilometers wide. These reed beds are important habitats, and they're also very important for bird feeding. One of the consequences of sea level rise has been that the reeds have not been able to keep up with sea level rise, and there have been some massive destruction of the reed beds, again putting stress on certain portions of the ecosystem. So the picture I want to paint from a biological point of view is that the Caspian Sea really is a global treasure for many reasons. It's an excellent natural laboratory for study of marine biodiversity and conservation of marine biodiversity. And this is a theme that I want to develop for the next few minutes. Well, what are the threats to the Caspian Sea? I mentioned poaching already. Well, there are other threats to the ecology of the Caspian Sea, one of which has to do with the construction of dams along the rivers. All of the rivers in the Caspian have dams that have been placed along them basically from the mid-1930s up through the mid or late 1960s, early 1970s. Along the Volga River, these dams are massive. They've created very large reservoirs behind those. Well, these dams have had several effects. They've altered the flow of water, to the Caspian Sea. It's also altered the flow of biogenically important materials, nutrients, carbon, and other materials to the Caspian Sea. So as a result, the ecosystem of the Caspian Sea has suffered measurably. So one of the major threats to the Caspian Sea is the construction of dams for power projects and also to use for irrigation. These sturgeon can migrate up to 1,000 kilometers up into rivers to breed. With the construction of the dams, the sturgeon can no longer go up that distance, and so they've lost much of their breeding grounds. Also, with the construction of the dams, the release of cold water right after winter into some of the breeding areas precludes the sturgeon from breeding because they need warmer water to breed. The massive size and volume of the reservoirs allows the cold to be retained in the water much more easily than in a normal river, adversely affecting the breeding of the sturgeon. The dams also have had effect on the water balance of the Caspian Sea. Remember, the Caspian Sea has no discharge to the open ocean. So you put water in and it either stays there or maybe it evaporates. So the level of the Caspian Sea is very sensitive to how much river water comes in. The first Volga reservoirs were built or finished in about, were filled in about 1950. Before that, we can see that the discharge, the water discharge from the Volga in cubic kilometers as a function of time. Before 1950, the water discharge was greater. For a period from 1950 to 1980 almost, the discharge on average was less, and now the discharge is larger again. Part of this reduction in discharge, though not all of it, was due to the filling of these reservoirs. And the reservoirs contain enough water to account for about 2 meters of, 1.5 to 2 meters of sea level rise over the entire Caspian Sea. So the reservoirs are very significant factors in the water balance for the Caspian Sea and hence its water level. If we look at the monthly discharge of the Volga to the Caspian Sea, we show 2 different time periods. This is just a chart that shows for the different months out of the year how much water goes through the Volga River into the Caspian Sea. The 2 periods of time are the yellow is pre-discharge, when pre-dams from 1940 to about 1958, and the red is the post-dam. What we see is a big change in when the water gets to the Caspian Sea, whereas before the spring water flows, the main spring water flows occurred in June. Now in June there's very little water that goes into the Caspian Sea. The water goes in earlier in May. So this controls the delivery of nutrients, it controls the delivery of carbon to the Caspian Sea. It affects when the major spring phytoplankton blooms occur, and the entire Caspian Sea is a food web that's based very strongly on this phytoplankton culture. So if you change when the phytoplankton bloom, you're going to change other aspects of the Caspian Sea biology. And this is in fact what has happened, as documented by some of the excellent Russian scientists working in this region. So river regulation is a huge effect on the Caspian Sea, not as noticeable as in the adjacent Aral Sea, where the Aral Sea has shrunk to almost nothing right now from misuse of water, but still has had a significant effect on this 44% of all the inland waters of the world. Well, another factor affecting the Caspian Sea right now, both the human aspects as well as the natural biology, is sea level rise. And fortunately, the former Soviet Union had a large network of tide gauge stations of various sorts in the Caspian Sea, so we've been able to tell quite well what sea level has done in the past 150 to 200 years. Unfortunately, again, with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, very few of these tide gauges, if any, still work, so we don't have as good data now as we used to have. This is a tide gauge, or I'm sorry, a water level curve for the Caspian Sea that extends back to about 1600. This is before the period of the instrumental record, but still relatively well documented from radiocarbon dating and other sources of other ancient shorelines. What we see is the period from 1930 to 1977, where there's an extremely rapid drop in water level of some 3 meters or so. And then from 1977, a very rapid rise in relative sea level. Interestingly, there's a period of high sea level in 1805, which has been suggested. I'm not sure how good the documentation is, but if this level were reached today, most of the major towns around the Caspian Sea would be largely underwater. This sea level, by the way, minus 26, minus 25, these are reference to the Baltic mean sea level. So in fact, the Caspian is some 80 to 85 feet below the ocean levels. So if you ever have a connection between the Black Sea and the Caspian in the future, there'll be a rapid filling of the Caspian. Hopefully that won't occur. So we need to focus a little bit on this rapid rise in sea level from 1977 to 1992. There's a tremendous concern about this sea level rise, and what caused it and what will be the sea level rise in the future. And since this is an area of particular interest of mine, I'll spend a minute or two talking about sea level rise. Well, the water level in the Caspian is really a function of two primary factors. First is river inflow. Obviously, more river inflow, the higher the sea level is going to rise. The second one is evaporation. There are huge rates of evaporation in the Caspian Sea. These rates up around the North Caspian reach more than a meter of sea level fall each year because of evaporation. And then down to the south, it's almost up to 1.5 meters of loss of water due to evaporation. So anything that changes the inflow of river water is going to affect the sea level, and anything that changes the evaporation in the Caspian Sea is going to affect sea level as well. Well, as I mentioned before, there has been an increase in water level of water input to the Caspian Sea since about 1980 or perhaps a little bit earlier, and that has helped cause sea level to rise. The second factor that seems to be contributing to sea level rise is decreased rate of evaporation. Because of climate change, local climate change, the winds are not as strong in the North Caspian as they used to be. If the winds aren't as strong, you get less evaporation from the water surface. So those two factors, increased river flow and decreased evaporation, seem to be what's causing sea level rise to occur here. Now, one interesting area that is worth mentioning is this small embayment off eastern Caspian Sea. This is called Karabogaz Gal. It's in what's now known as Turkmenia, and this is an evaporation basin. There's a very narrow connection between the Caspian Sea, goes through some very narrow straits into the Karabogaz Gal. When Karabogaz Gal is completely opened up, its level is below that of the Caspian Sea because the evaporation is so fast in the Karabogaz Gal. You can't push water through fast enough to keep up with evaporation. So there's actually been a waterfall going from the Caspian Sea into Karabogaz Gal, and it's left a very rich source of salts for use in a variety of different kinds of mining activities for the chemical industry in the past. As sea level was falling, it became clear that Karabogaz Gal was a sink of water to the Caspian Sea. So to slow down the sea level rise, some active measures were taken to prevent Karabogaz Gal from evaporating water. So this is just a time series showing from 1930 up to about present how much flow went into Karabogaz Gal, therefore how much flow left the Caspian Sea. And we see that about 10 cubic kilometers per year, or 5 to 10 centimeters worth of sea level rise or fall, went into the Karabogaz Gal every year. The former Soviet Union decided that this was too much, it was contributing too much to sea level fall, so they built a dam across the Karabogaz Gal Straits and completely cut it off. This dam was some 15 years or so in planning. It was finally constructed in about completed in about 1981, I think, 1980, 1981, which is when sea levels started to rise again. So by the time they got through all the bureaucracy, they're as bad in the former Soviet Union as we are in this country in terms of overplanning. By the time they finally got the project completed, they really needed to have Karabogaz Gal open again to take water out of the Caspian so sea level wouldn't rise quite as fast. So for a few years, they contributed to sea level rise in the Caspian Sea instead of slowing the fall of sea level. So much for the foibles of human planning. Well, what will happen in the future to sea level rise? There are probably a couple of million of scientists in the former Soviet Union. Probably half of them have some prediction about sea level rise in the Caspian Sea. It's a very hot topic. It's the big crapshoot for the former Soviet Union. So there have been many, many estimates of sea level rise and where sea level will be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and 30 years from now. And of course, there's no way of predicting exactly where sea level will be 10 years from now or 15 years from now, though they'd like to do this to manage the basin well. We focused on a slightly different aspect of this question, and instead we looked at some of the fundamental physics accompanying sea level rise. Remember I told you that the North Caspian is extremely flat, maybe a 1 meter rise in the land level for every 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers you go inland. That means as sea level rises 1 meter or 2 meters, you're going to be flooding huge areas of the North Caspian Sea, large areas. And it turns out you can flood up to maybe 15 or 20% of the total area of the Caspian, of the total Caspian, just by raising sea level some 2 or 3 meters. So this provides a feedback, a negative feedback, which helps control sea level. Because as sea level is rising, you flood more land, you have more exposed water surface, or you have more evaporation. More evaporation means that you're going to reduce the rate of rise of sea level. So our predictions, brave predictions that they were, says that sea level, there's no way that sea level is going to continue to rise linearly in the future, but in fact sea level will rise for a while and then will flatten out. Similarly, if sea level starts to fall, the Caspian will never empty out completely, because as sea level starts to fall, the area of the Caspian becomes smaller very quickly, which means you have less evaporation, which means you're taking less water out of the Caspian Sea, and that's going to cause a stabilization of sea level on the low end as well. So this gave us the concept of self-regulation of the Caspian sea level and made us a little bit less worried about a lot of these drastic predictions that have been made for the Caspian Sea. I think this is a reasonable concept. I don't know that we've sold too many Russian scientists on this idea, but it's an interesting concept that unfortunately is not true for the world oceans. Well, why are we concerned about sea level? Again, this particular slide shows just the Kazakh part of the Caspian Sea, and it shows different shorelines. And just for a scale from, say, this point on down to this point here is a distance of some 150 miles or so. So it's a significantly large-scale map. The shoreline from 1977 was showing where the blue meets the orange. The shoreline at present is where the green meets the orange here, along here. So you see that there have been large areas in the North Caspian that already have been inundated, and the green shows the areas that will be inundated if sea level rises, I think, just 1 more meter from what it is right now. So huge areas will be underwater, including some of the larger towns like Ataral in Kazakhstan, and including these areas over here, which are the oil fields of the Tengiz region. And if the oil fields are flooded, then there's a significant danger of increased pollution to the Caspian Sea. Well, there's another potential threat to the Caspian Sea, and that's shown a little bit in this diagram for any geologists out in the audience. And this is a cross-section looking from Kazakhstan south through the northeast Caspian Sea region. And what we see in this cross-section is in the green are the surface sediments of the Russian platform. These little finger-like protuberances are salt domes, and below the salt domes you see some pre-salt sequences which are oil-rich sequences. And if you look throughout this region, there are significant areas that have large volumes of hydrocarbons extracted, extending all the way from Astrakhan and then jumping across to the east side of the Caspian Sea and up along an arc. There's a thought that some of these reef complexes shown in yellow and blue underlie the North Caspian Sea as well. The oil experts estimate that there's about 40 billion barrels of oil beneath the North Caspian Sea that's ready to be taken. 40 billion barrels makes this particular field about 6 to 8 times the size of the entire north slope of the United States. It's a significant find. So there's a lot of excitement now in Kazakhstan and all over the world about trying to extract this oil. And one of the great concerns is if there is oil drilling in the North Caspian Sea, what effect is that going to have on this fragile ecosystem? Currently, there are several laws, a Kazakh law and a Russian law, which forbid any industrial activity in the North Caspian Sea region. And although that law isn't followed to a T, at least that law right now precludes any oil drilling. But Kazakhstan needs foreign currency. and it's running out of sturgeon, it's going to have to go someplace else for foreign currency. Most likely, Kazakhstan is going to allow the Western companies to drill in the North Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea so far is relatively healthy. It's not like the Black Sea. It hasn't declined as fast as far as the Black Sea. The ecosystem still is relatively healthy, although it's threatened. And the key issue in the Caspian Sea is going to be to try to preserve the ecosystem and the biodiversity of the Caspian Sea, not allow it to go the way of some of our other Great Lakes of the world and other marginal seas like the Black Sea have gone, but to try to preserve it carefully. And how you do that as these industrial activities increase is somewhat problematic. So for the past year and a half, Dr. Glushko and I have been working with the Kazakh government and the other governments of the Caspian Sea region and putting together a proposal to protect the biodiversity of the Caspian Sea. We've had several meetings with the Kazakhs. Mobil Oil Corporation is paying for this work on behalf of the government of Kazakhstan. Our client, we're really working for the government of Kazakhstan, but Mobil Oil Corporation wants to make sure that the appropriate studies are done to help preserve the biodiversity of the Caspian Sea with or without oil drilling in the Northeast Caspian. They'd prefer to drill in the Northeast Caspian, obviously, but they want to make sure that we understand the baseline conditions of the Caspian Sea very well. We understand the non-oil related environmental pressures on the Caspian Sea so we can fix those pressures. If oil creates a problem, then the oil companies would be responsible for taking care of whatever problems it solves. But even if there were no oil drilling in the North Caspian Sea, huge threats face the Caspian states, and these threats must be faced up now, or we're in danger of losing the sturgeon fisheries, we're in danger of losing the very rich endemic population within the Caspian Sea. So this proposal is a $35 million proposal that will be submitted probably in May to the World Bank by the government of Kazakhstan on behalf of all the governments of the Caspian Sea. And the background for this is to try to help provide ways to conserve biodiversity in a lasting fashion. It's not enough to pass a law and say you can't poach. That's not going to do any good. There's already laws saying you can't poach. If the people have no jobs, if the people have nothing else to do, then they're going to go out and poach anyway if that's their only source of foreign currency. So this proposal, besides establishing a research base of the Caspian Sea to examine its biodiversity, also looks at a whole set of social mechanisms and political mechanisms and legislative mechanisms to have a self-sustaining biological conservation effort, trying to set up green tourism, for example, trying to take the poachers, the people who are poaching, instead of letting them poach, have them lead nature walks or nature trails within this region, set up large areas of preserves and have the poachers work in the preserves to help maintain the biodiversity there. Try to set up more industries in this region that are environmentally sensitive to give the people in the region some jobs or some reason not to poach and some reason to hope for a livelihood that will be in harmony with conservation of biodiversity. The governments of Kazakhstan and Russia are extremely serious about this effort. They realize what a treasure they have. They realize that they need foreign currency also, and that the realism is that there's probably going to be drilling allowed in the Caspian Sea. But they're very anxious to obtain some of this international funding to set up long-lived sustaining mechanisms to conserve the biological diversity. I'm hoping that many of you in this room in 4 or 5 years can go visit Kazakhstan or Russia, visit the Delta, and actually pump some of your greenbacks into the local economy and meet some of the people who formerly were poaching in the region but now are helping to conserve the biological diversity. It's a beautiful place. If you ever get an opportunity to go see it, I would encourage you to. Thank you very much.
Dave, on one of your charts, I noticed a very small number of preserves. I think they were mostly in the Russian area. Is there a major effort going on there now to stories?
Well, remember, we're looking at a different culture that doesn't necessarily look at preserves the same way that we look at in this country. Their feeling was that the entire North Caspian Sea was a preserve, was a nature preserve. So they have one vast preserve that covers the entire region. They also have a series of smaller nature reserves that are set up for existing land fauna and flora, as well as marine fauna and flora. What we're trying to get them to do in this proposal is we're trying to set up mechanisms so they can identify reserves that will preserve either certain habitats or certain species of organisms that are critical to the North Caspian Sea, to help carry on the biodiversity of the North Caspian Sea. So there is a deficiency probably of small reserves as we know it in this country, although the whole north area is a conservation zone to some extent. But to be effective, I think you're going to have to be more focused and set up some more focused reserves of many different types and many different sizes. And that's part of the goal of this proposal that we prepared for Kazakhstan. In the back? Dale.
Does the Volga Delta maintain any wetlands like the Danube does, acting as a filter for
Yes, it still functions as a wetland, but some large percentage of that Volga Delta it consists of rice fields right now. Tanya, do you remember what percentage of the Volga Delta is rice fields now? About 30% is rice fields, so that part of the filtering capacity has been removed from the system. Now with sea level rise, of course, some of those areas will be returned.
And the Russians are aware of the levied thing that question will probably...
Well, some people are and some people aren't. There's a lot of pressure to keep Astrakhan from going underwater and to keep Baturau from going underwater. These are their major cities. There's a lot of pressure to keep a lot of the smaller developments from going underwater. So what we're trying to do is to try to help explain that local levying on a small scale to protect key infrastructural elements is probably going to be allowable, or probably would be useful, but certainly not trying to protect the Volga Delta from sea level rise or protect the North Caspian. Remember, when we talked about sea level rise, we mentioned the importance of increasing the area of the North Caspian Sea to increase the evaporation to reduce the rate of sea level rise. If you put levees up, you're not going to increase the area of the Caspian Sea. You're not going to get this negative feedback, so sea level will rise even farther. So I think the point has been made. Now it's just a matter of getting through all the different ministries within Russia and getting them to buy onto it. The ecological ministries certainly understand this danger, but not necessarily the other ministries, and not necessarily some of the local people, local groups.
Is Volga primarily in Russia? Is this some of the tributaries of Kazakhstan?
I think the Volga may be exclusively in Russia. Yeah, and this.
Most of the control on the river is in Russia, not Kazakhstan.
Well, the Volga control is in Russia, right? And it's the Russian farms that are being fed by water. It's the Russian hydroelectric plants that are generating electricity for Russia. This is a very serious inter-country dispute because Kazakhstan wants to stop this damming because they want to conserve their biodiversity, but you have the farmers and the village people up in arms. Again, as part of this...
How is that being addressed?
Well, right now it's not really being addressed, I don't think, on a national basis, but we've implemented mechanisms in this proposal to address some of these transboundary issues to try to come to some more optimal solution, either in the timing of the flow, which would solve a lot of the problems, and even maybe in reducing the size of some of the reservoirs.
Is there any effort by Volga or you people or anybody else to bring Russia into the fold and make this combined?
This proposal is for all of the Caspian states, not just for Kazakhstan. It was Kazakhstan's idea, based on a report that was written last year for the Kazakhs. They've taken the leadership role But in the last 3 weeks, I've been to Russia twice, meeting with the environmental ministries to get them on board and to get their scientists on board. This program will only go if all the Caspian states participate. So that effort is being made. Yes?
What's happening with radio levels in the
Well, there's some debate about this. I don't think we know the full answer right now. There, of course, are natural radionuclides that come into the Volga because of some of the mining that occurs upstream and some of the outcrops of ore-bearing materials upstream. But in the Astrakhan region and in the Ataral region, just to the east, there are major polygons, nuclear polygons, where testing took place. Part of the nuclear testing was trying to create caverns underground to store gas condensates and other materials of a strategic nature. Basically, they'd use nuclear weapons to hollow out big reservoirs and then hope the nuclear, the heat generated by the blast was strong enough or hot enough to fuse the rock around it and have a good storage area. Recently, there have been reports that these areas are leaking radioactivity, but nobody has really gone out there to see. There is no radioactivity capability in Kazakhstan. They don't have a laboratory set up for it. People are living in areas where radioactivity is is all around them, and they don't even know about it because there hasn't been enough investigation. Kazakhstan really was a dumping ground for the former Soviet Union. Huge amounts of rocket fuel, for instance, with very complex mixtures, supposedly were dumped out over the Kazakh territory. Mining took place, nuclear polygons. There are 26 or so nuclear polygons in Kazakhstan alone. It's an area that really requires a significant amount of environmental investigation and enhancement in the future.
So the sturgeon are sexually mature at 14 to 18 years?
How big of the sturgeon? Well, it depends on the type of sturgeon. Probably the beluga sturgeon would be a couple of 100 pounds, 150 to 200 pounds.
So the ones that they were harvested in the picture were probably...
Not beluga sturgeon, right. There are other sturgeons, right. Yes?
Seals feed up the sturgeon.
The seals compete with the sturgeon. I don't believe they eat the sturgeon themselves, but they compete for kilka, which is what is kilka, shad or herring or something. Anyway, it's one of the local fish in the Caspian Sea. This is one of the issues now that there's some international pressure to stop the harvesting of the seals in the Caspian Sea. The seal population has been maintained somewhat constant because of the seal hunting in that region. If you stop seal hunting in the region, then the Caspian seal population is going to grow to some undeterminate size until it's limited by some other factor other than natural hunting. What that will do to the kilka population and how that will compete with the sturgeon resources is not quite clear. So some of the groups that are arguing strongly for stopping at least illegal hunting of the pups and maybe even legal hunting may not understand the complexities of this managed ecosystem, and before stopping everything there needs to be some better understanding of what the implications will be. Steve?
You know if the salinity level has remained constant over time? Constant flow of fresh water?
It fluctuates in the North Caspian Sea quite a bit, depending on the Volga inflow. So the years of great inflow, large inflow, the average salinity in the North Caspian is reduced of the Northwest Caspian is reduced, although the salinity of the Northeast Caspian is increased in that case because of the complex circulation. Overall, the salinity within the Central Caspian doesn't seem to have changed very much. It's mainly the North Caspian that fluctuates. Yes, behind Steve.
Did you have an opportunity to search for ancient shorelines that might bear your evidence on your activity or any of the others?
You don't have to search very far. You can look at aerial photographs, satellite images, and see them all over. So they're very, very obvious in this region. And there's been a lot of Russian work by geomorphologists and geographers dating a lot of those shorelines, a lot of excellent work. So it's clear that in the past the sea level has gone up and down quite a bit. The evidence is there.
You had shown a cross-section of North Caspian Sea at about And is that the typical cross-section of the geological structure, or just is that means the whole north area is a big oil field because the saltwater structure?
Well, the key thing here is to find those sediments that are that provide some source rock so you can generate hydrocarbons. And those areas are highs in the basement. So even though the salt is spread out over quite a bit of this region, the Mesozoic salt is spread out quite a bit, what you really need are source rocks which require these reefs. So what they're looking for are highs in the basement which to generate the oil itself. They think that such a high exists here within the Caspian Sea. If you go to the West Caspian Sea, presumably the same source rocks don't exist. There also is a little bit of salt in the post-salt sequence. A little bit of hydrocarbon in the post-salt sequence, but the vast majority appears to be in this pre-salt sequence, the reefal pre-salt sequence. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. There's a question here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the whole project doesn't progress without funding. Does there have to be a lot of cooperation between the countries involved in the function of the funding that they receive?
Yeah, absolutely. None of you is going to get out of the door until you contribute to this project, by the way, so I want to make that perfectly clear. No international agencies will provide funding to support the Caspian Sea unless all the Caspian states participate, because otherwise one country, Iran, Dagestan, one of those countries can continue depleting the resources while everybody else tries to preserve them. So there has to be an agreement between all the countries. One of the big difficulties here is Iran. Iran is a country that the U.S. doesn't work very closely with anymore. It's an area that is not part of the European community's outreach program. Ms. Steele mentioned earlier a European community program in the Caspian Sea. They're trying to work in the Caspian, but they're not allowed to give money to Iran, but they can give money to everybody else in the region. So the regional issues present some difficulties. Before any funding, large-scale international funding takes place, there has to be some kind of agreement between all the countries to help conserve the biodiversity. There is a convention for protection of bioresources in the Caspian, which is almost ready to be solved, but it's hung up by two issues. One is who will have the headquarters for this commission that will serve the convention. And of course, everybody wants the headquarters in their own country. And the second issue is more important, and that's what are the local fishery zones within the Caspian Sea. They're setting up fishery zones which are exclusive to individual states in the Caspian. And Azerbaijan wants some 40, 50, 60 nautical miles. Kazakhstan only needs 15 or 20, and they can lock up most of the mineral resources and other fisheries resources. So it's not clear when this convention is going to be signed because there are these international boundary issues. What we're proposing is that in May, when we go back to Kazakhstan, that all the countries' environmental ministers meet in Almaty in Kazakhstan and sign a declaration stating their intention to sign a convention in the near future. And the declaration would state their support for the idea of conservation of biodiversity. And we hope that in itself will be enough to start the funding. It worked in the Black Sea. It should work in the Caspian Sea. Yes?
Do you have any data on the impact of global warming in that area? Would that push it to a scenario one of increased water level?
My opinion of global warming predictions is that they aren't good enough to say on a regional basis what's going to happen. So there are some excellent Russian global warming specialists, Israel and some other people who have made these projections before, but I don't believe their models any more than I believe our U.S. models. So I'm not sure what effect global warming will have, other than it will have an accelerated effect compared to an open ocean coastline.
Is there a sport fishery attached to the sturgeon that would pull in all of the rainbows here?
Yeah. Well, I think, since this talk was supposed to be about fly fishing, right? Yeah. I think for those of you who came here thinking I was going to talk about fly fishing, you probably can go to the Caspian and catch some sturgeon on bottom flies. They're bottom feeders. So if you leave your lure on the surface, forget it. You're not going to catch them. But yeah, that's part of this the proposal that we're putting in is to try to develop a sport fishery, a controlled sport fishery. One exists now, not to my knowledge, no.
What are the potential species of fish for sport fishing?
Well, I mean, I'd love to catch a 1,000-pound sturgeon sometime and put it back. It'd be a highlight of my fishing career. They don't have a lot of the open water sport fish that we have here, and I'm not quite sure what would turn a fisherman on most, but certainly the sturgeon would be one appealing type of fish to catch. Do you know the Russian name for it? And I'll tell you, yes or no. That's not going to help me. I need the Russian name. Sorry. Yes?
Any acid rain impact or concern?
That doesn't seem to be a real major concern in the Caspian Sea. The big concerns are, sea level rise, contamination by heavy metals from the ore mining operations, contamination from oil pollution from the Baku oil region and a little bit from the Tengiz field. When they have a well blowout in that region, that well tends to blow for quite a while. This oil here is very high in hydrogen sulfide. It has about a 30% hydrogen sulfide content. And all these wells are tremendously overpressured. So if a well blows, it blows for a while. And there are stories of wells that have gone out of control for more than a year before they've finally been capped and blowing hydrogen sulfide, which changes to various sulfurous oxides, and have coated vast areas of the sea and land throughout the region. Big disaster area over there, big disaster zone. So I think those are much more serious problems than a little bit of acid rain. Other issues, environmental issues, are eutrophication. It's a big issue in Boston Harbor. It's a big issue for all the coastal seas. It's what's destroyed the Black Sea. That's starting to be a big issue in the Caspian as well. And if eutrophication occurs, of course, it strips a lot of the oxygen from the water column, and nothing's going to be able to live, including the fish. Another issue that's of some concern is in the Black Sea, there's a tiny jelly-like organism, like a small jellyfish, called a ctenophore. And this originally came from the U.S. waters, maybe around Chesapeake Bay. We got zebra mussel from the Caspian Sea. We sent this ctenophore over to the Black Sea. And this ctenophore at times accounts for about 95% of all of the biomass of the entire Black Sea. 95%. This is this one little visitor that came from this neck of the woods. Well, that ctenophore really doesn't do best in waters with the salinities characteristic of the Black Sea, but it loves salinities of the Caspian Sea. So if it gets into the Caspian Sea, this little ctenophore could cause massive damage to the ecosystem. And there's a canal, the Volga-Don Canal, that connects the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. Ships use it. They empty bilge water, take in bilge water as a potential transport mechanism for this ctenophore into the Caspian. So that's one of the issues we're really worried about. We raised that issue about a year ago. Before that, they hadn't considered it locally. One of the reasons for the proposal is to set up mechanisms to guard against importation of exotic introduced species like this that might take over significant parts of the ecosystem. Okay. Yes, ma'am. And this is my Middle East. Yeah, this came from right around the Caspian Sea region. Tashkent, I think, right? Pravda? Настя? No. Okay, well, thank you very much. I went a little long. I get carried away. Is that okay?